Hello and welcome to today's episode of Rawkode Live at the Rawkode Academy. I am your host, Rawkode. Thank you for joining us today. Today we are taking a look at jsPolicy, faster and easier policies for Kubernetes using TypeScript and JavaScript. If you like writing everything as code, today is a great episode for you. Before we begin, there's a little bit of housekeeping. Please remember to subscribe to the channel and tick the bell to get notifications of all new episodes. And I would also really appreciate it if you could like the video and comment and share with all of your technologist friends. You can also support the Academy with the various memberships options available. You can find them at rawkode.live. There is Sandbox, Incubated and Graduated, a level for individuals and organizations. And if you want to come and chat with nearly 600 technologists on cloud native Kubernetes and everything in between, join us in the Discord available at rawkode.chat. All right, let's introduce today's wonderful guest. I'm joined once again by Rich and Lukas from the Loft team. Hey there, how are you both doing?
Really good. It's good to be on again, David.
I always feel really bad when I throw that question out to two people and I just let them decide who's going to go first. And I really should just, I should be better at this. I should say, hey, Rich, hey, Lukas, how's it going? Or maybe that doesn't really help. I'll work on it. Okay, so for anyone who doesn't remember you from last time, isn't familiar with you from Twitter, etc., can we just get some introductions? And we'll start with you, Rich, just because you're on the left, and then feel free to hand that over to Lukas.
Yeah, my name is Rich Burroughs. I'm a senior developer advocate at Loft Labs. I've been with the company for about 6 months right now. We work a lot on making Kubernetes easier for developers to use, and also people like platform engineers who own the clusters and are managing them. So we are very interested in multi-tenancy, self-service, all of those kinds of things. We really are looking to find the areas that that people are kind of bumping their shins on and try to make them easier.
Thank you for sharing. Lukas?
Yeah, I'm Lukas, CEO of Loft Labs. I have the pleasure of working with Rich on all of these exciting topics. And yeah, we're really on a mission to, help companies roll out Kubernetes and expand their use from, essentially right now they may have, 10 or 20 or even 40 people having access to Kubernetes. And we help them to do, essentially the leap to 1,000 or even 5,000 engineers and more. And obviously, there's a lot of tooling and automation required. And jsPolicy, which we're talking about today, is one of the projects that we're working on in the open source space that may make that transition a little easier.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. For people that aren't familiar, don't remember, we had you on recently and we took a look at vCluster. So you're kind of tackling a lot of these really difficult problems that people have with Kubernetes. The first one with multi-tenancy, and we had an absolutely flawless demo. So you have set the bar high, I'm afraid, and we're not going to accept anything less today. And now jsPolicy, which is tackling that really difficult thing where people are wanting to write more admission controllers and policies to restrict and segment access to their Kubernetes clusters as well. So I'm curious about what's the drive there? Like, I mean, these are really difficult problems. Are you just sitting down and going, right, what's painful for us and let's solve it for other people? Or do you got some other semantic you're using there?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much customer driven, right? We're in a lot of conversations with these platform teams that essentially run into these problems that have to manage Kubernetes at scale for a large number of engineers. And, in these conversations, we just spot challenges. And yeah, I mean, there are definitely pretty hard problems. And with the technologies that we're building, we're trying to make it as easy as possible for these platform teams to essentially, enable developers to more efficiently work with Kubernetes. And yeah, they are complicated. So big shout out to, Loft Labs CTO, Fabian, who is actually grinding a lot of the code on this end. We may come up with feature ideas and throw them at Fabian, but he's actually the brain of, how do we actually implement this and, make it work at scale. So big shout out to him.
Yeah, he's fantastic. We've also had some new engineering hires recently too, so the team is growing.
Awesome. So maybe we can kind of address jsPolicy directly then. I mean, do you want to give the pitch first. Like, what is what is jsPolicy, and why should people take note? Who wants to tackle that?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, there we go.
the idea behind jsPolicy is essentially writing policies as code. And I think the pain point that we saw was essentially that OPA with Rego has a language, it's kind of like the default standard when you're looking at dynamic admission control in Kubernetes. Everybody looks at Open Policy Agent, and they have to adopt Rego as the policy language. Which is not a Turing complete programming language, and feels very off for a lot of engineers. And we were thinking, can't we simplify that by essentially just taking a language that people know, but still assure that when people write these policies that they can maintain them very well, that they can test them very well, and that it's very integrated into what's already existing in terms of ecosystem. And JavaScript and TypeScript just have such a vibrant ecosystem when you're looking at, testing frameworks and CI/CD integration, all these kind of things, right? It's pretty seamless because, it's just such a popular language and such a, vibrant ecosystem. So, yeah, we tried JavaScript, and it seems to, reduce the complexity a lot in terms of, if I write a policy in Rego and I look like 3 months later, I look at that policy, right? I'm having a pretty hard time understanding of what it actually does. And I may be the person who actually wrote that policy, right? So I don't want to know how anybody else feels that has no clue about this policy in the first place. And we hope to make that a little bit easier with JavaScript, especially since most companies already have people that know JavaScript, although they may, not necessarily be part of the platform team. They may actually be working on some front-end stuff, but they're definitely qualified engineers in pretty much any company that know JavaScript.
Nice. Yeah, I'd add a couple things. First, you don't have to be a JavaScript expert to, write some basic policies with the tool. You don't have to go the TypeScript route. We'll kind of show you the basics too. But the thing I like about it is that it shouldn't have to be the platform engineers who write all the policies, in my opinion. There are some policies that you want to be maybe cluster wide and have those folks writing, but I feel like other people, potentially should be able to contribute too. And you could have platform teams, application engineer teams, writing policies, or at least being able to read them and understand them, right? So like, even if they're not the ones writing them, they can at least look at the policies and kind of know what's going on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. JavaScript, it has to be the biggest programming language in the world these days, I think, with just the ecosystem is there. And it doesn't matter if your background is from the front-end world or JavaScript world anyway, because it's a C derivative language. Like, it feels familiar, even if you've never written a line of JavaScript before, to Go developers, to C developers, C++ developers, even Java developers to a certain degree. Like, the language primitives and constructs are mostly familiar. So I think it's a really sensible choice for a tool like this. And to go back to Lukas's point, we've all been the person that looks at a bit of code, Rego or not Rego, and goes, the hell is this code doing? What idiot wrote this? And then you run the git log or whatever, the git show, and you go, oh, it was me. I've certainly been guilty of that many, many times. So I think it's nice that I will have the potential and the ability to write policies in JavaScript, because hopefully it solves that burden. That cognitive load that it takes to read and consume, even YAML at times. So very excited for today's session.
Yeah, when Lukas first told me about the project and showed me what they were working on, kind of the prototype, I was immediately struck by how easy it was to just read the example policies and understand what's going on. And I'm not somebody who writes a lot of JavaScript, so it's not like I have more than a very, very, very fundamental understanding of it. But you'll see as we get into this that it's pretty easy to tell what's going on.
I'm worried now, Rich. You've said easy twice, and I'm like, that is.
I shouldn't have said that for a demo.
Now when something goes wrong, I'm going to go, you said it was easy, and then Hulk smash my computer. So, okay, let's pull up the homepage. because I think, and I'll put some words in the viewer's mouth here. Like we've already mentioned Rego and OPA, and we've got Kyverno that people are familiar with, and we've had episodes on in the past. And there is this kind of comparison here. Do you maybe want to run through this and just tell people what is different in jsPolicy versus these other systems?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the biggest differentiator is how you define these policies. In Kyverno, it's mostly YAML, very, very close to Kubernetes. I mean, in the end, jsPolicy and OPA also have their CRDs, right? But the actual policy logic is not defined in YAML itself. All of them support validating policies, of course. There are some differences regarding mutating policies. You have especially when you look at Kyverno, that is pretty challenging to express changing an object in YAML, right? Just because of the limitation of that declarative language, versus, in jsPolicy, essentially it's mutating an object just as you would do in any, kind of object-oriented language, right? You have this JSON object and I mean, it's kind of funny, Kubernetes, essentially we're writing YAML code, but kubectl under the hood converts everything to JSON, right? And before it sends it to the API server. So what better language to, manipulate these objects with than JavaScript? I mean, it's literally the JavaScript object notation. So it's pretty straightforward to essentially, have something like pod.spec dot something, and then essentially write equals new value, right? It's pretty straightforward. And I think one thing that is really, really different about jsPolicy is a new type of policy, actually. We introduced a policy that is reactive, and we call them controller policies, because they're kind of similar to actually writing a fully fledged Kubernetes controller. So essentially, there are a couple of things that you cannot do with policies. So let's say you want to have a network policy in each newly created namespace, right? That could be a policy in your company. How do you enforce that this network policy is there, right? That is really hard in admission control, because in the regular admission control flow, that is part of the namespace creation request, right? If I run kubectl create namespace, the admission control happens first before the namespace object is actually persisted in etcd. But the network policy can only be created after then the namespace exists, because it has to live in that namespace. It's pretty challenging. So what we do with controller policies is essentially introducing a new class of policies, or that essentially lets you react to Kubernetes events. So we have the event in Kubernetes that is, thrown, namespace has been created, right? And you can watch on that event and then essentially react to that. Whether you check if a network policy has been applied within 5 minutes or so, or if you create it yourself throughout that controller policy. There's just so many options. And then another big difference is essentially jsPolicy is based on JavaScript, so you can make use of the entire tool chain regarding testing frameworks, regarding package management, right? You can essentially, there's npm.js, the registry for npm packages. You can essentially use any JavaScript or TypeScript library out there and just import that and use it in your JavaScript policy. And we see that as a huge benefit to essentially share policy code. Because right now, you have to create something like a policy hub or something like that to essentially share policies, like a totally different ecosystem. And it's a lot of work to build that up and to maintain that. But if we're already having npm.js, that's essentially a given. It's pretty straightforward for people to run npm publish and even publish things to their own internal registry and, share things across teams and things like that. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, and that's a pretty interesting concept.
Yeah, most companies are going to already have that internal registry too, so.
Yeah, I'm sold. The package management and having been able to distribute my policies via npm and pull them in that way, I think is super cool. Just because I'm familiar enough with that tooling. And I think anyone who's written any kind of Verno and OPA policies, like testing them is really hard, and being able to fall back on pretty mature testing frameworks available in the kind of Node and JavaScript ecosystem, I think is an absolute bonus. And I'm really excited about controller policies, and I want to see if maybe we could play around a little bit with that today. Mutating admission controllers are great for modifying the YAML that's kind of being admitted, but being able to actually react to that and deploy more or other things, I think is really cool too. So this is going to be fun. Now, you pointed this out to me just before we went live. So I figured we could run through a couple of these just to show people what a JS policy looks like, what it's actually doing, how it works as a high level overview. And then what we'll do is we'll dive over to my cluster and get all of this running. So this is like your JS policy playground in a sense, in that we have access to a policy here and a standard Kubernetes object here, and we have a traffic light system to tell us what is happening. Did I mess that up?
Yeah,
or is that sound about right?
No, that's totally right. I really like starting with this deny default namespace one too, because I feel like it's something that everybody's going to understand, right? Even people without a lot of Kubernetes experience, that, we just don't want things to get launched into that namespace.
Okay, so let's just run through this policy then. We've got our API version and kind, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. We've got access to policy.jspolicy.com. I've not seen V1 Beta 1 in a while. That's a nice flashback. I'm glad to see that still kicking. And then we've got kind.js policy. We've got metadata. And then here's the guts of it. So we have to tell it which operations that we want to apply the policy to, which resources. We've got the scope. So I guess namespace and cluster-wide would be my two options here. And then we've got a JavaScript key that just has a conditional in it. I can just look at that and I understand what's going on, which I think is a pretty cool.
No. Yeah, like I said, when I first started looking at this, I was just almost shocked at how easy it was to look at these things and understand them, even as somebody who's not written really much JavaScript at all.
Yeah, so we've got a policy here that says whenever I create a resource, any resource as designated by the star, if the request object's namespace is default, we just deny it. I'm assuming deny is just a special function that blocks the admission of the object. So let's take a look. We got this ability here to then create an object. This is in the default namespace, and we get a deny. Nice and simple. So I guess the fix here is to change the namespace. And it works. That's cool. I think it's a nice visual way to introduce people to the project and just understand what's actually happening. Although I suspect at some point in my career, I'm going to start dropping actual real policies and payload and workloads into this and just using it as a sanity check. But we've got people in the chat already asking if they can use this to break clusters unclustered. Thanks, Russell. They're always thinking ahead of me. We got a question from Madhan as well in the chat asking, is this similar to Pulumi? One of you want to tackle maybe the differences here?
I guess in a way it could be seen like that. Oh, sorry, Rich, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't know that Pulumi has functions for doing policy stuff, but I could be wrong.
Not to my knowledge.
I guess I think Lukas was about to say that it's maybe a bit similar in that, you're able to use a language that is a standard language that you're already familiar with, to do the things that you want to do, as opposed to having to learn a new language or a DSL or something like that.
Yeah, from what I can see here, I'll just add my kind of perspective to it. I would probably use Pulumi to apply these policies to my cluster and then use jsPolicy within the cluster to be the controller and the admission aspect of it. So I think they work side by side together pretty well.
Yeah, the scope of Pulumi is a lot bigger.
Yeah, that's true. All right, let's take a look at this. this add node selector. So this is a mutating policy. So this just means that when we apply something to the cluster, we can use jsPolicy to augment it or make it conform to whatever policies we have. Is that, I've never had to describe mutating admission controls before. Does that make sense?
I think so.
It's
Yeah.
fair to say,
I mean,
yeah. Fixing resources,
Yeah,
right, to make them match the policy is a good description.
Cool.
yeah, I think an example that people would probably be familiar with is, making sure that things have labels on them. Yeah.
Cool. Well, what I love, right, first and foremost, right, is not even the fact that this is a mutating policy, right? Is that I have comments that live within the multi-line YAML that are going to persist if I do a get or describe on this YAML, right? They're not going to disappear on me, which is something that happens with the control plane. When I apply YAML with comments, they're all stripped out. So I really like that, assuming it works the way I think it does. But what this admission controller is doing is, so we've got create again. This time we're only mutating pods. And if it has a label called add node selector true, it sets.
Yeah, it's like
okay, so it's
only
adding
resources in namespaces, right, that have this label. So if the namespace has that label, then. But again, like in this demo, we don't have a real cluster, so it won't really check if the namespace has that label.
Oh, right. Okay. So the namespace selector says if the namespace itself has a label called node add selector true, then what our policy is doing here is saying, okay, add a node selector foo value test2, and then mutate the object. So it's just adding a node selector to the YAML. So there we go. It adds these fields here. I like it. Nice and simple. Here's a question then that comes into mind. So far, what we've seen in these examples is that we use this JavaScript key. Does that change the TypeScript for TypeScript, or is it just a generic key and I could put TypeScript in here if I want?
Yeah, that's kind of diving a little bit more into the architecture of jsPolicy. Essentially, there are three different CRDs that we're introducing. There's the jsPolicy CRD that you're seeing here, and then there's the jsPolicy bundle CRD. Folks that may be familiar with JavaScript know about these like Webpack bundles and things like that. It's essentially compressing JavaScript to embedding all the dependencies and making it highly efficient, essentially optimizing the code. And the same thing happens when you take TypeScript and you compile it down to like vanilla JavaScript, right? Because that's essentially what's running in your browser later on. There's two ways of creating a policy. You can either embed the JavaScript logic like it is here and write it inline in the spec JavaScript. But you can also create that jsPolicy bundle and leave this spec JavaScript out, and then jsPolicy would take that bundle. If you do the inline route like we do here, what actually happens behind the scenes is when you're creating a jsPolicy object like shown here, and the controller sees that spec JavaScript object, it actually runs Webpack and creates that bundle for you. So in the end, what we're using V8, that's like Google's JavaScript execution engine that they run in Chrome, etc. And we actually let it run only the jsPolicy bundle. But how that's created is essentially up to the user. It can be created out of your TypeScript project with a custom CI/CD pipeline or whatever that creates that bundle object and then the jsPolicy, or you do it inline and then essentially the controller would do that translation for you.
All right, very cool. Okay, my next question. Does it support Wasm bundles?
No, not at this point. It's actually a pretty interesting route to go. I think KubeWarden from the Rancher folks is pretty much focused on that. It's kind of funny. We were pretty much working at the same time on jsPolicy when they were starting to work on KubeWarden, and we had a little chat before KubeCon Europe when they announced it. And it was super interesting for, to hear that they essentially had the same idea at the same time, but went a different route, because they went the Wasm route and we went like the V8, plain JavaScript route.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think it just shows that there is a demand and a need that people want to be able to write their policies in languages that they understand and have the ability to do conditionals and loops and all these other things that we need. So, yeah, definitely. Okay, you mentioned the architecture. We do have the architecture on the docs page, if I remember. Is this the one?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you can kind of see with these little red bubbles of what the execution order essentially is. When the kubectl request comes in at the Kubernetes API server, it's essentially calling a webhook manager inside jsPolicy. And that webhook manager really looks at the jsPolicy objects, which you see here in green. The three green areas are essentially the CRDs that we're introducing: the jsPolicy bundle, and then jsPolicy violations, which essentially is more for reporting purpose to see what went wrong inside the cluster, which policies were actually hit and denied, and requests and things like that. And then jsPolicy, those objects essentially define which objects to target. So they tell the webhook manager, hey, whenever we're creating, as we saw earlier, pods or things with certain labels that match, those kind of things are defined in the jsPolicy resource. Also operations that create, delete, whatever is sent to the Kubernetes API server. And then that webhook manager essentially would call mutating, validating webhooks as part of the regular, Kubernetes, API server request workflow. And it's essentially, mutating webhooks are executed sequentially, because otherwise you kind of have like a, who wins both write the object, right? Both mutated. So they execute it sequentially, just like Kubernetes does it. And then validating is executed in parallel, because if one of them tells you deny, it's automatically denied. So we can speed things up by running them in parallel. Kubernetes does these webhook calls under the hood essentially, and then objects are persisted in CRD in etcd, which is step number 3 here. And then there's the part that typically admission control frameworks don't address, because it's outside of the scope of regular admission control workflow. And that's these events that are created from the API server when new resources, are added to etcd or altered, or anything happens inside the Kubernetes cluster. And that's essentially when these controller policies would be executed.
Okay, so we'll get hands-on in just a second, but I've got one question, because I want to make sure I understood this a little bit correctly. So jsPolicy, when running my cluster, is registered as a dynamic admission controller, like these other tools, and that handles the mutating and validating aspect. But you're actually setting, is it just like a global watch on the Kubernetes API server that says, give me all changes, and it goes through the controller policies?
I think we're watching on events here.
Okay, so it's just
essentially, yeah.
All right. Okay. Is there anything else in the documentation you would like to go over before we deploy this to our cluster?
No, let's get some hands-on experience with it. Sounds good.
Okay. Awesome. So should I do Quickstart or the full guide install? You got a preference?
No, let's do Quickstart. That's probably the easiest one to get started with.
Okay, so it wants me to use Helm to deploy to my cluster. I think I have Helm. I do. Okay. So we'll just do a standard install, create namespace, off we go. Hopefully it won't take too long. Done. So let's see what we've got installed on our cluster. I'm assuming it created, just by that create namespace, that we have a jsPolicy namespace. Okay. So let's take a look. Pods. So it's just a single pod. This is the one that's running the V8 runtime, and I'm assuming like an HTTP server to receive the webhooks from the API server.
Right. You can also run this in essentially more high available mode, right? Essentially spin up more replicas and things like that. That is also possible.
All right, nice. Okay, so validating. So we have a jsPolicy validating webhook admission controller, and I'm assuming the exact same on the mutating side. No. Interesting. So is that
you
what we
try
expect?
to create a policy which is mutating, you may see a change there.
All right, okay. So it's only the mutating admission controller is probably only added when it's required. Okay, I'll trust you for now. So let's create our first policy. So this is just the exact same one that we kind of had in the playground area. So let's just create this. So we'll call this deny default. I can't type. Oh, I really can't type. I had to look at the keyboard and everything there. Done. Oh, my computer's struggling a little bit with me, but we'll get through it. So this is the, I kind of caught this during the playground and I wasn't sure whether to ask a question or not, but this is a namespace, but it's actually checking the namespace. So if I apply this to the jsPolicy namespace, I mean, in theory, no object should ever come in where the request namespace is default, right? Like, should
yes, that's correct. Yeah.
So how would I make this just a cluster-wide one instead of a namespace?
No. I mean, so this essentially means when you're creating namespaced resources, regardless of which namespace. So the jsPolicy object is not namespaced, right? It's a cluster-wide resource.
Okay. I completely missed that. Right. Gotcha. That makes more sense. So let's apply it then. But it doesn't matter where the namespace is. I should now just be able to run get jsPolicy. I'm wondering if the plural is going to be policies like that or like this. There we go.
Yeah, you can also now run jsPolicy bundle to actually see, that inline JavaScript has been converted to webpack bundle in the end.
Yeah. Let me just learn how to type again, though. There we go. Okay, so when we apply the jsPolicy, it's being compiled to an artifact, and that's what we have in the bundle. So if I run -o YAML on this, I'm not sure what I did there. Oh, because I need that first. Yeah. And this is the bundle, which is just base 64 encoded, I guess.
That's correct. Yeah.
I mean, I can't help myself but take a look now. So, oh, it's binary encoded. So it's not just the Webpack output as like minified JavaScript. It's actually stored as a binary file. Okay. Cool. So I guess to confirm that our policy here is working. In fact, I'm sure I should just stick to the guys instead of making an assumption now. So we've applied our policy. And then we can see in action by trying to create some workload in the default namespace. So here we're just going to say kubecontrol create deployment nginx, where the image is this. And our admission controller denies it, saying we are not allowed. Perfect. Exactly what we wanted. Okay. So should we start? I mean, do you want to dive straight into mutation controllers, or should I go take a look at some of the basics on the apply policies? What interests you both?
Yeah, I think the coolest part is actually taking a look at the examples. So if you hit that GitHub button, that icon on the right upper corner, in the project itself, there is a lot of example policies that really help to get started with things. You can either filter by feature or by use case. You can also dive into, more TypeScript-based stuff, more advanced use cases.
Okay, let's take a look at feature first. And is this jsPolicy features? Is that what that means?
That's right. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
What's your favorite, Rich?
Probably the mutating one.
All right. So I'm just going to copy this. My computer's about 20 seconds behind me, but I'm sure it's going to catch up. There we go. Okay, so let's see if I can work out what this does without having to ask for help. In fact, I'm going to delete the comment before I read it. So we have a mutating policy that looks at the create and update operations of pods. It's checking our annotations. Okay, so we've got an optional, so there might not be any annotations. And if there's a required annotation, no, I'm confused. Okay, so this isn't, all right, okay. I was overthinking this. This could be anything. I could say that I have a requirement that all pods should have a Rawkode annotation that says live. And if this doesn't exist, this is just adding that annotation. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Right, okay. Yeah,
Yep.
in my head, for some weird reason, I was like, we had some configuration that said all pods must have this required annotation label that would add other labels, and very much overcomplicating it for no real rhyme or reason. So now let's apply this to our cluster first. And if we try this Nginx deployment again, but if I just run this in the jsPolicy namespace, then what we should see is our Nginx pods all have the Rawkode live annotation, if I've understood this correctly. So I'm going to describe pod jsPolicy. And if we scroll up, nice. We mutated that and added our Rawkode live annotation. It's nice. It's not difficult. It's just JavaScript.
It would have been probably even less difficult if you hadn't deleted the comment too.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to see if I could work it out without.
I know. I'm just saying.
All right, I'll read the comment. I mean, someone's put in a lot of time and effort to actually read and write these comments, so it would be rude of me just to delete it. So there's some really important information here that I can see already on scanning. So we have the ability to like exit early with a deny or allow statement. What happens if I omit deny and allow and just let the function return? Is there a default action?
No, it's essentially that webhook would not do anything as part of your, API server request.
Okay, and then we can call mutate if we make any modifications. I mean, the API is pretty simple. Deny, allow, mutate, and off you go. It's pretty cool.
Right. There are a couple of more functions, actually, special functions. Obviously, you can use anything built in JavaScript and anything that is possible, via any kind of, JavaScript libraries which you're importing. But if you go back to the other tab with the documentation, you can expand functions down there on the bottom, JavaScript reference. And you see there's more functions that we added, essentially for ease of use. I think one of my favorites is actually list and get. That is essentially to receive resources out of the Kubernetes cluster. So let's say you want to have a policy that makes sure your ingress host names are unique, right? You can't just look at the current object coming in. You actually need to take a look at all the ingresses in your cluster, right? And you essentially need to retrieve those resources somehow. You can do that with list, for example.
Ah, very cool. So I have I've got this very opinionated view of what GitOps means to me and my own production infrastructure. And like one of the things I try to omit from all of my repositories is domain information. Like this is rawkode.com or this is staging.rawkode.com. I'm actually trying to rely on the component that provisions the cluster to inject a config map that has, oh, this is what your domain is for this cluster. I could now use jsPolicy with a mutating policy that says, go fetch this config map, pull out the value for the domain, and inject that into all of the ingresses as I apply them to the cluster, and just simplify my entire setup there. That is awesome. I love it when I like do an episode like this and I have a real use case for the thing myself that I can go and just deploy.
It happened last time you came up with use cases that we hadn't thought of. So it's really fun to get you to take a look at these things, because you definitely always have like some new takes that we hadn't even considered.
Yeah, I just like to do weird stuff with technology, but this I'm really excited by this. Like I can already see this fixing my GitOps, because I just don't like putting that information in the repository, and I'm not a big fan of my GitOps tooling writing back to the repository with this information. And this solves a lot of these problems because it's much more dynamic than I've had access to through things like Kyverno and OPA in the past. So it just opens up a whole bunch of these, I don't want to say like power user things, but people that are going slightly off the beaten track and just want to do more exploratory experimental stuff, having the ability to do those on the fly lookups, it's almost a superpower. And I think I said that with vCluster too. So you're winning me over with your technology.
I think there's an important thing in terms of being opinionated with tools. Like a lot of users, I think, especially newer folks, want you to be opinionated. They want you to, have an example architecture, or, to be able to tell them really in basic terms how to use the tool. But you're always going to have those folks who have different use cases, right? And different needs that like the basic kind of opinionated workflow won't address. And so the tools also have to be flexible enough for people to be able to do the things that they need to do.
Yeah, well said. Okay, maybe we could cover a couple more of these functions, and then we'll jump back to that examples and take a look at a couple more of the features. So I see read file sync, and immediately I'm thinking this can read a file from somewhere. Yeah, so this is pulling in secret information from the secrets directory. That's what, and fetch sync. So I can actually pull remote URLs from like guests or online, etc., and just pull them into accounts. I guess that's the cool thing about having access to the JavaScript stuff. What else do we see? What's requeue? Let's see.
That's a good question. I think is that for controller policies.
Yeah, this one has a big comment. That should be a warning sign for me that just move on. Go look at something else. Come back to this one.
Oh yeah. This is for controller policies. You see that on the bottom, right, in line 30.
Yeah.
So controller policies are a little bit different because essentially they're not happening as part of your kubectl request, right? They happen afterwards based on events, and they're queued, right? So essentially event comes in, and then you have these policies which are put in a queue and executed. I think, first in, first out. And then you can essentially add the request to the queue again. There may be certain use cases where you want to reevaluate an event later on again.
Okay, cool. Let's pick one more just because I think it fits in with some of the stuff we've already looked at. So I see a warn here. We've seen deny, we've seen allow. I guess warn allows it, but logs somewhere that, hey, you may want to look at this in due course. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly it.
Nice. Intuitive, which is good. All right, let's pick another.
And, a situation you might want to use that in is, something you're going to deprecate down the road, and you want to start letting the developers know that, they can't depend on that thing being there anymore.
Yeah, 100%. Something we see, sorry, I need to go look at.
You also show it in kubectl, right? So the developer is in the end, able to see that output as well, which is pretty powerful. I think kubectl itself does it as well with like the deprecated ingress, better resources, etc. They did that for a couple of versions before actually killing that API group off, which makes a lot of sense because otherwise, not everybody reads the change logs every time they come out, and makes sense. Their page is long, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things, and I think it fits in really well with this kind of tooling, is that we've seen pod security policies being deprecated recently. And the answer to that is to rely on tools like OPA and Caverno, and I'm assuming jsPolicy. Is that something that's available to people? Like, do you ship a bundle that is the basic pod security policies for people to take advantage of? Or is that something that they would just write their own policies for to enforce the bits that they want?
I'm actually not sure if we have an example in there, but we may. I know that we have something about escalating privileges of pods, but I don't know exactly if we have pod security policy.
We do have denied privilege escalation, so maybe that's a good one to take a look at. And we also have a couple of, well, we've got one question and no mocking me in the chat. So there we go.
I know.
So I use my clustered automation for all these clusters just because it's so well written now. But yeah, the Ambassador Ingress controller is currently broken since I upgraded the clusters to 122 because of a deprecation. And I'm not getting warnings about that. So yeah, very funny, Noel. Thank you for watching. Russell has got a question. So what are the scopes? The namespace filtering looks to be done by the JavaScript, so it seems like namespace scope isn't required. Does the scope alter the shape of request object? I think that's the same assumption I made that Lucas kind of tackled earlier, but do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, essentially you can specify within the policy really the scope of that policy, right? Whether you restrict it to a certain group or you restrict it to an API server version or a resource, in this case pods, right? And then a certain operation, you can restrict it to a certain namespace, and essentially we won't even receive that request, right? When you don't specify that. So there's really like no overhead for any other resources. It's only those resources that you actually specify that will be validated by the particular policy. So there's pretty extensive filtering capabilities.
Yeah.
So yeah, you don't have the thing firing off, when people are altering other kinds of resources.
Yeah, and I think I'll just highlight something that Lucas said earlier, just so it's not missed. But all JS policies are cluster wide, right? I took a note of that in my head. So yeah, okay. Yeah, so all the policies
the policy object itself is cluster wide, right?
Yeah, exactly. Got it. Okay, so we pulled up the privilege escalation one. So this is an example of one of the pod security policies that kind of disappears. And there's a little bit of syntax in here that's that is just JavaScript, isn't it? So this is, I'm going to try and explain JavaScript and I'm going to fail miserably, but feel free to correct me here. Right. So we're just saying that we want to take a look at all the containers in the pod. I love that it defaults to empty. Can you apply a pod with no containers? I'm not sure. The init containers definitely could be defaulted to empty. And then this is the spread operator in JavaScript. So essentially what we're saying is get all the containers and all the init containers, and then we're using the for each iterator, where we're just checking to see if the security context is set in any of them. And then you just got a deny message here that says that's not allowed. Yeah. I love that I can read these. I've got to say, it's pretty nice. Okay, question from Frank. Is it possible to validate existing objects or resources, I guess, and get some sort of report out of them?
Yeah, I mean, you can actually take a look at what you've already denied in your example by getting the resource jsPolicy violations, which should give you an insight of what has been violated.
Okay, so that's a new custom resource.
Exactly, yeah. That's more for the reporting purpose.
Violate. There we go. Well, let's take a look at this in YAML. I mean, I'm assuming I could maybe describe it too. too early? Okay. Oh, there we go. So we got a violation here. So this is grouped by the policy itself, and then the status is just a list of violations that it's denied. And we've got a timestamp, the object that was denied, and then the message. So I think what Frank is saying is like, say I've got my production infrastructure already up and running. And then I think, okay, I've watched the Rawkode live episodes and jsPolicy is like the bee's knees. So I'm going to go and deploy it to all of my clusters now. It's not going to work on any of the resources within the cluster until we do a new update or apply or something like that. Or is there a way to retrospectively scan existing resources?
No, that does not exist at this point. But I think none of the policy engines do that right now. I mean, essentially, everybody's just hooking into the regular admission control webhooks, and they're not being fired on existing objects unless you reapply them. But I mean, some objects may. I mean, even if you were to just add an annotation to all objects, like a random annotation, you set it to true and then you remove it again. You may have policies which only listen to create because they forbid create actions. So there's no way to essentially capture everything, I think.
Yeah, although I guess this is where your controller policies could come in. I mean, you could probably write something as a controller policy that looked for violations and triggered updates via annotations or labels or something silly like that, just to force them to go through the loop. But that's a segue. We don't need to go into that right now. But Frank, there are violation reports that are available here. I'm assuming you could write tooling to pull those out and store them in Prometheus or InfluxDB or anything like that to get access to them. Frank is actually the author of the Kyvernal Policy Reporter. So I'm going to ask him now.
Nice.
I'm going to ask him now to add support for this so that we can take advantage of all that great tooling as well. Okay, let's jump back to our examples. So let's see if we can pick maybe just one more feature, and then we can see what we want to do after that. So do either of you have anything that you want to show off before I pick one randomly?
I think dependencies may be interesting to see.
Does this mean it's going to use something from NPM?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, okay, cool. Oh, you're pulling on Lodash. I was expecting left pad. You've let me down. But so let's see. We got a create operation on pods. Only now we have access to a dependencies key on the spec where we can just list any NPM dependency. And then in the JavaScript, we're just using Lodash to do comparisons. It's pretty neat the way that works. I'm assuming then that when the jsPolicy is ingested, that the Webpack step is just pulling all those in and spitting out the bundle, just like all the other policies.
Yep. Yeah, that's correct. That's essentially why we separated jsPolicy from jsPolicy bundle. And again, like typically, so this is actually a little ugly, right? Because you're writing JavaScript within YAML, right? So the benefits I was mentioning earlier regarding tooling don't apply to this because like your IDE will not, show code highlighting, fix your imports, and your package JSON cannot be scanned by dependency vulnerabilities and things like that. So the actual best approach is to create these bundles yourself. And essentially just have a JavaScript object, a package JSON, and essentially create these bundles and then create the jsPolicy without dependencies and without JavaScript here. But if you just want to test something on the fly, essentially this dependencies section allows you to do the same as the dependencies section in your package JSON.
Okay, so I'm trying to think how this would work in like a GitHub flow. So it's likely that I would have my own repository with just like a npm in it that creates a JavaScript project. I start to write all of my policies as JavaScript, probably each one being its own module. And then I would configure my Webpack to just compile each of those down. And then I guess you would just use CI/CD to then dynamically generate the YAML and apply them. I'm not like, do we have an example of what that would look like?
Yeah, if you go if you go to the docs, there's actually a project that is set up for TypeScript, but you could just write JavaScript in it as well.
Mm-hmm.
You see that there are jsPolicy SDK, um, like write policies. Yeah, exactly. And you can find that project on GitHub, and it's essentially a starter project, right? You can check that out, and essentially it has the Webpack and everything configured, so that you can directly get started and write your policies with that.
I've got to say, I have tried writing a Webpack config in the past and failed every single time. So I'm glad it exists. So let's see what this looks like then. Okay, so we got policies and then annotations. Okay, let's take a look at the namespace one. Okay, so you just provide like the skeleton. Oh, I was expecting that to be a bundle.
No, this is actually just the policy, because the bundle is created by Webpack, right? From your source code that is in this index TypeScript file, right? And the YAML code is essentially just defining the JS policy, like, the scope of the policy, right? Which objects, is it mutating? Is it validating? Things like that. And then the bundle is created on demand.
Okay, got it. Does this show me how it's applied to the cluster?
Yeah, if you scroll down in the README, it shows you the npm commands, right? So essentially you have the npm run compile, which is doing the compile step, and the output of that compile step is essentially you're going to see a policies folder. So right now you just have a source folder and a test folder. It's going to create a policies folder, which is on git ignore, because there's no reason to version these. I mean, you saw that earlier, right? They're base 64 encoded, and they're also gzips essentially. So that's why you saw like the binary kind of output earlier. We would actually have to unzip it as well. So there's no reason to version that in Git, because it's essentially just your source code. And you can run that compile command, and it would create that policies folder, and that policies folder would contain the policy YAML and the policy bundle YAML for each one of the policies that has a folder in this, source folder.
Okay, so yeah, you can see all the different scripts configured in the package.json there. So kind of the standard compile, the Webpack bundling, and then there's the apply step here too. So okay, that makes a lot more sense.
It was actually pretty cool. So we have this compile watch, which whenever you change the source code or the policy YAML, it would automatically kind of do the node-mon watching step. But you can also run the watch apply, which would not only create the YAMLs, but also run essentially kubectl apply, right? Which is pretty smooth if you're, working in test cluster. You don't even have to manually do the kubectl apply when you're writing your policies.
Okay, got it. And you're just doing that through a Webpack plugin, right? The writing the YAML, the policy YAML. Is that right? Is that what this says?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And in the end, that policy, that JS policy code, if you really want to do like GitOps, etc., that is also something you could, check in your repository, that, policies folder. But again, like it's not a requirement. You could essentially also have a CI/CD pipeline, which essentially does that npm compile step and then runs kubectl apply. It's pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, I think some of them are seeing now with like Argo and Flux is that they're really providing the ability to run custom commands on these repositories as well. So I mean, we're almost at a stage where I can just hook this repository up to Argo or Flux and just say, here, go run an npm compile apply, and it'll just do it. So okay, very cool. Is there if I click on the test directory, is it going to have a test or is it going to be empty?
I think it has like one sample test. Yeah, there's one sample test.
Nice. So yeah, we can. It's always nice to see an example of tests. I like testing, so being able to see how to do that. Yeah, I'm definitely going to be forking this repository and stealing it for my ingress injection thing. So very nice.
Yeah, it's also kind of nice. You can see here that we're actually importing on the top the official like Kubernetes client node, right? and we're creating pod objects down there. And because it's TypeScript, everything is typed, which is pretty neat. So we're essentially creating V1 spec, for the pod, and things like that. And it's essentially, a lot more reliable than having only end-to-end tests where you apply YAML to your cluster and see if the policy actually works. You can actually run very fine granular tests on pretty much each function that you're writing in JavaScript.
Awesome. Okay,
I expect there will be some folks who don't get this deep, who will just use it and do, things more like what you see in the examples, and that's totally fine. But there is this extra power to use all of the tools that come in that JavaScript ecosystem if you want to get that deep.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a question.
There's also.
Oh, sorry, Andy, go.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say we have a question from Jack in the chat, which I think I can even answer. But he said, "Why import whole of Lodash here?" I mean, the answer is because you can, right? That's why we would do it.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, I think Webpack is going to strip a lot away that may not be needed even. I'm not a Webpack expert, so I don't know how it works, but I think they're doing a lot of optimizations in there.
It does a lot of tree shaking and minification and a whole bunch of other fancy stuff that I've seen the compiler talks from conferences, but I never paid enough attention to understand it. But yeah, I believe you're right. Okay.
I think one thing I wanted to point out is sharing functions as well. If you go to the policies folder again, to the source folder, with that contains these policies, you see this lib folder as well, right? On the one level higher. And that's essentially where you could, define functions that would be used by several of your policies. So typically your policies are grouped by resources, right? So you have certain policies which apply to deployments. You may have other ones which apply to pods, right? They have a totally different spec, but you may want to check similar things. You may want to prevent, privilege escalation, for example, and that's part of the pod spec. But you also want to check it for deployments and stateful sets. And in lib, you'll find a function which essentially can be shared and called from both of these policies, essentially.
What is it? And containers or metadata?
Yeah, I think if you go to containers and then validate capabilities, for example, is one of them, or validate images is another one, right? We're essentially running something here on the pod spec, and this function expects the pod spec as an input, right?
All right, okay.
And if you're now going to the policies again, so to the source folder, and then policies, and then you'll see deployments and pods is two different, right? We're validating them differently because we may run different checks on them, right? Like deployments might have like 8 other functions that need to be checked, right? They may have different annotations, etc. But both of them want to do that capabilities check. And then we can essentially, if you go into validate pods, for example, and then in the actual TypeScript code, you'll see that we're running this validate container capabilities and we're passing the pod spec to it, right? It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I like that. Being able to extract all the common functionality into shareable libraries to avoid duplicating code everywhere that you go. And just having simple functions like, validate namespace and validate container images. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Very nice. I like that. All right. Is there anything else from the examples repository you would like to show our audience before we finish up for today?
I think that was a lot of content already.
No, that's all right. We have covered a lot. Definitely a lot. Oh, hold on, let me pop us back over to. There we go. Yeah, there is a lot here. I mean, I think just exploring the capabilities from the validating and mutating aspect and being able to bring that into my cluster to be able to enforce the policies that I need and make the changes that I need is a great way just to get started and kick the tires on this and build out that tooling. I really need to explore how to apply this to my cluster and get it started, and I'm very excited to do that. And we never really touched a lot on the controller stuff, but there's just a whole bunch of different capabilities there that I could just have a field day with playing with. So
I think there's, potentially at least a couple of different types of users of this, right? Like one is the people like you who, are very familiar with JavaScript and TypeScript and want to get deep and do those things. But I think, another set is the folks that were the reason that this got built, which are the people who have tried to use some of the other tools and, had difficulty for some reason and are looking for something where the policies are easier to read. And the thing that I want to emphasize is that you should be doing admission control, whichever of these tools that you use, right? Like if you're not doing it at all and you're not doing it because you tried and it was hard, I really recommend taking a look at jsPolicy.
Yeah, you're 100% right. Like people need to be adding policies to their cluster, especially with pod security policies being deprecated. There's a whole bunch of malicious things there that just need to be stamped out. And jsPolicy is a nice way of doing that. I really like that capability of working with VS Code, getting syntax highlighting, even using Copilot. I wonder how many of my policies it could probably write if I just let it try and do it for me.
That's really funny.
Sorry, where'd you go?
No, I was just going to say I hadn't even thought about that. I don't have access to Copilot yet, so I haven't.
I've got to be honest. I'm so amazed by it, and I know there's a whole bunch of ethical debates right now about whether we should be using it and such. But I have found that it reads my mind. Like I can just write, I want to start something with this, and then it goes, oh, you're trying to do this thing, and I'm like, yeah, I am trying to do that thing. So maybe in time, as more people adopt jsPolicy and are writing their policies, we'll find that a lot of that Copilot magic is going to work there. And pod security policies I can see that being distributed as an NPM package, and then layering on top of that more and more best practices that are really hard to find in the Kubernetes ecosystem. And I think with jsPolicy, Loft are now in a really unique position to be able to distribute that in a very consumable way that we haven't really seen before. So very exciting stuff. Any final words before I let you both get back to your day?
Just thank you so much for another invitation. That's really great that we are talking about a second project just like I think like a month later or so, or 2 months later. It was a lot of fun talking about vCluster, and it looks like jsPolicy went smooth regarding the demo as well. I'm glad to see that. Since you mentioned at the beginning, I was kind of afraid, is this gonna break something? But it didn't.
This one is a little different because vCluster is something that had been part of our commercial product before we open sourced it, right? And so people had been kicking the tires on that for quite a while, but jsPolicy is quite a bit newer. But it's always fun to see your take on these tools, David. Like, you always come up with some things that I hadn't even thought of. And so it's a real pleasure to get to come on here.
Well, yeah, thank you. It's just really, I'm really happy with what I've seen so far. And like I said, I've already got a direct use case that I'm going to have to go and kick a tires with this week. So, I'll be sure to share my successes or failures, but I'm pretty confident based on what I've seen today that it's going to be wonderful for what I need. But unfortunately for you two,
know how it goes.
Unfortunately for you two, that you've now come on and demoed 2 projects that I really, really like. So like the third one's going to have to be phenomenal. I don't know what you've got cooking in the kitchen, but it's going to have to be good. So no pressure.
I think we maybe taking a break from launching new open source tools for a little bit. We'll see.
Well, yeah, because you're already tackling difficult problems like policy and multi-tenant. Like anytime I now have a difficult problem, I'm just going to have to be like, hey, here's the thing. Please go run with it. So we'll see. All right. Thank you both again. It was an absolute pleasure to work through this. A very exciting tool. I encourage everyone who's watched and followed along to go check it out and simplify your policy management on Kubernetes. I hope you both have a wonderful day. I'll let you go now, and I'll hopefully speak to you again soon. Have a good one. Bye.
Thanks, David.